What do you say when somebody asks you what you do for work? What's the thing that comes to mind when somebody asks you what your work is? For many of us, we'll think of a job that we do that we get paid for. That's the answer we give when people ask me what we do for work. But some might go, well, I'm retired, so I don't work anymore. And so when I talk about my work, it's not something I get paid for. Some will talk about school or uni, things you're giving your energy to understand. And some will think about something that I care about and I put my time and my energy into building. Work is the thing that we spend most of our time doing. And what we're exploring in this series is that if following Jesus is about all of our lives, then surely our faith in Jesus should integrate with our productive hours. And I wonder if you've spent time thinking about what following Jesus means for however you use most of your time during the week. For some of us, we may never have thought about this, and that's fine. This is why we're doing it, to help to explore. Some people say, well, the way that faith and work integrate for me is that I try to share my faith with people at work. Some maybe feel this deep sense of connection between what you do and your trust in Jesus. But for many, I suspect, is something like, well, I've thought about it, I feel like it's important, but I don't know. I feel like there's this disconnect between what faith is and what work is. And our desire in spending time thinking about this and in thinking about what we do when we gather in community is to help bridge this divide. And I think part of what we need to do in order to bridge this divide is to understand how our story and our understanding of our work, what we find ourselves doing with our waking hours, fits in with a much bigger story of God's purposes in this world. And so what we're trying to start to do is to see that the story of the Bible is actually framed as a story about work. This is one of the main themes that comes through the first few chapters of the Bible. Last week we looked at Genesis 1 and we saw that it starts with God working, that He has worked since the beginning of creation, bringing order to chaos in productive activity that is focused on forming this place for humanity to dwell and for Him to dwell in relationship with His creation. Today, I want to look at what Genesis 1 and 2 says about the work that God gives humanity to do, which we can see is tied directly to what God says in this account when He creates humanity. In Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Unlike all of the rest of His creation, humans are created in God's image and likeness. There's been a lot written about what this means, but I want to point out from the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 that what it means to be created in God's image is integrally connected with the work we are given to do and the way that we are to go about doing it. First, we see from what God says immediately after creating humanity in His image is that to be in God's image is to be given a particular role in His creation. And that role is to rule and to subdue. Have a look. He said, "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. And God blessed them. And here's the blessing. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Humans are created to do what God has been doing. And God gives them this work as a blessing. God blessed them and said, here's your work to do. Procreate, to fill the earth, to bring it under control and to rule over everything in it. God orders things in his creation of the world in such a way that there is untapped potential that he intends for humanity to discover through the work that they do, because that is just the kind of thing that he does. The picture here is that on the one hand, God has given them this blank sheet of paper for them to write the story. It's like a blank canvas for them to start the drawing, which is what they'll do in their work. But on the other hand, it's a creation that is already so full and so rich and so complex that there is like endless discovery that can come out of it through their work. God says, be fruitful and multiply to the humans, because in doing this, they image him. In having children, they form families, who form communities, who form society, who forms culture, with all expressions of creativity that come to make full life. God says, subdue and have dominion over the other creatures. And you might read subdue and have dominion here and think they're about abusing and using things for our own purposes. And this is what they will become a chapter later. But at this point, evil hasn't infected God's work here. And so ruling and subduing isn't about abusing position or power or using God's creation in destructive or selfish ways, but it's about using the power that we've been given as a gift to bring out the potential in God's creation. It's what you're doing when you mow your lawn, for example. You're subduing the lawn to use it for good purposes. Or when you tend the vegetable garden, you're subduing the ground by turning the soil and fertilizing the plants and pulling out the weeds to make it productive for growing food so that you can live and share a meal. To be made in God's image here is to be co-workers with God in his creation, doing the kinds of things that he does. He gives humanity that role to play in his creation. When we get to Genesis 2, we see this play out further. Here it's clear that not only does God give humanity this role to fill the earth and rule with him in it, but he puts humanity in this garden in Eden to represent his presence. And to work in his image is to represent him to one another and to the rest of creation. In Genesis 2, verse 15, it says, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. In the verses just before this, it's described God as this gardener who has planted this garden and out of which plants just spring up from the ground. The garden in Eden is the place of God's presence where life just happens because he is life personified. And out of this source of all life flows a river that waters all the surrounding lands. The picture that's being painted here is that God's created order is like a temple that he has built. And humanity is placed in that temple to work it and to serve in it. Paul Stevens points out that in this text, there are like concentric circles that flow out, where at the center is this garden that God plants, the place of his presence and life, and abundance comes out of that place. The rivers flow from this mountain garden into the surrounding lands because God is this source of life. So garden at the center, the next circle out is the area of Eden, which is this home for Adam and Eve, who God is putting there to live in his presence and to work in the garden. But beyond Eden, there are these other lands where the rivers flow out to. And humanity is given this task of working the ground in the garden and procreating there in order that the life would flow out like the rivers to fill the whole earth with the presence and abundance and creativity and productivity of Eden. And the work that they do is it's enjoyable, it's easy, because it is work done in the image of God as his representatives. This is temple imagery, where God's presence through his representative people should make the rest of creation productive and conducive to life. God puts Adam in this garden, we're told, to work it and to keep it, we're told. Paul Stevens points out that the two words used by God in this command in Genesis 2:15 are for Adam to abad, which is to work or serve, and shamar, which is to take care or keep. And these are the exact words that are also used throughout the scriptures to describe serving God and keeping his commands. In this story, the work that God gives Adam to do in the garden is to serve and keep. And in doing that work of cultivating the garden, Adam is explicitly depicted here as working for God like a priest. The manual labor that humanity is given to do, and the work of procreation and rearing children and forming communities and culture, it's work that is given by God and done in worship to God, because through this work, humanity represents who God is amongst themselves and to the rest of creation. I want us to notice here that work is given as a blessing by God. It's given as an expression of humanity's purpose. Work is the form that worship first took. And I realize that you might hear this and think, well, I didn't experience this in my work. So what's this all about? My work is supposed to be a place of worship, but that's not what happens for me. And we do need to keep this in mind. We need to wait till next week to see how this vision for work all comes crashing down. But the point is that work in the Garden of Eden is given for the sake of enjoyment as expression of worship of their Creator. What happens in the next chapter is that work moves from something that is done for the sheer joy of it, something that's productive by its very nature, to something that has to be done in order to survive. And yet I don't want us to miss that work itself is designed as the primary way for humanity to reflect the goodness that God pours out on us, to express back to him in worship by the way that we work. Martin Luther puts it this way: God could easily give you grain and fruit without your ploughing and planting, but he does not want to do so. What else is all our work to God? Whether in the fields, in the garden, in the city, in the house, in war, or in government, but just such a child's performance by which he wants to give his gifts in the fields, at home, and everywhere else. These are the masks of God, behind which he wants to remain concealed and do all things. What Martin Luther is saying here is that to work in God's image, for God's purposes, is to be his face to the world, to represent him through the work that we do. And of course, if humans are to represent him, then it just follows that we need to know him. Being made in God's image is all about understanding ourselves in a web of relationships. Relationship is central to what it means to both image God and to work in his image, because he creates from relationship and for relationship. His work in creation isn't for his own selfish ends. It's for the good of his own creation. There is relationship right through what he creates. He creates man from the earth. Man is made from the stuff that he'll work with. There's a symbiotic relationship between humanity and the earth. After God creates man, he creates woman. Why? For relationship. God can't call it good until relationship is possible to share the work that he does with others. God forms and orders this whole thing so that he himself can dwell in relationship with his creation. And when it comes to working as those made in God's image, relationship with the Creator is a central idea. Trust and obedience is crucial to the productive and enjoyable work that God intended for us. And when we work in this way from a place of relationship, we reflect a family likeness. Genesis 1 depicts humanity being made in God's likeness, as if it's describing God being in labor through his creative work to birth his children. Genesis 5, 1-3 says this more clearly. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam," or man. "When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them. He named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth." What happens with God creating humanity and Adam creating Seth is described in exactly the same way. Humans are made as children of God, and work is given as an intended way to deepen that relationship. So not only do we perform a role that he's given us to perform, but also in a way that represents him in how we do it, and that we do it in and for deepening relationship with him. Darrell Cosden says, "The image of God verse in Genesis 1 show us that our ordinary human work is an essential aspect of deepening our relationship with God. What today we might call being transformed into his image. Our relationship with God, our imaging him, is our essence as humans, while the working activity is the expression and realization of that essence. I think that we need to relearn how to do this, to express and realize this essence of who we are as humans in the way that we work, to be his priests in his creation, taking up our roles of multiplying and subduing and ruling as co-workers with him in this world. And this is where we're going in this series. This is why we're doing it, to try to help us to unpack this more. We've first looked here at God's intent for work. Next week we'll look at how it all goes wrong. And in the lead up to Easter, we're going to be seeing how Jesus comes to restore God's original intent for his creation and his work amongst us. Because Jesus comes to show us what it means to image God. Colossians 1:15 describes him in this exact way, that he is the image of the unseen God. This image of God looks like Jesus at work. But Jesus at work is really humanity at work as God intended. Because in this story, seeing a human fully at work is seeing the image of God. This is what Genesis 1 and 2 are telling us, that humanity working in that garden is the image of God. It's a role that means ruling and subduing creation. This is the role that God gave humanity from the beginning. This is a role that we will come to see Jesus perform as the image of God. In the way that Jesus does this work, he represents God to us, showing us what God is like in the way that he serves and keeps what God has given him to do. In the same way, God says that we represent him when we do what he gives us to do as those made in his image. And Jesus shows us that this is all for relationship. Jesus brings about a work of renewal to restore us in relationship to God, so that we might be a people who dwell with him as co-workers with him in his good creation. This is the vision of work that God gives us. And my prayer is that this vision might help to form our thinking and our approach to our work in this world. Whatever it is that God is giving to you to use your energy on in purposeful and productive ways.